The pen hung suspended, hovering above the paper by only a breath. Caleb Thorne, the man at the head of the underground empire that controlled the entire port of Boston, sat utterly still at the end of the table. The hand holding the pen trembled faintly, and the ink inside the tip quivered with every pulse of blood, as if his body already knew that this was the moment his father's empire would slip from his grasp. His black three-piece suit was flawless down to the last stitch, but his face was not. Dark circles lay deep beneath gray eyes, sweat beaded at his temples, and his throat tightened as though he were trying to swallow a bullet. Around the table, the faces remained motionless, like carved stone. Raymond Holt, his financial advisor for 18 years, sat with his arms crossed, the corner of his mouth lifting in a thin curve. Two attorneys bent over their documents, and across from them, two men in gray suits, representatives of the Moretti family, glanced at their watches with the calm patience of men who already knew they were about to win. The contract lay on the table. It was not a bankruptcy filing. Something like that would have been easier to stomach. It was worse. It was a transfer of control. The seaport, the warehouses, the shipping routes, everything his father's blood had bought and held. If he signed, he would lose everything. If he refused, he would be dead within 1 week. Caleb drew in a slow breath. The pen tip touched the paper, but then a voice came, cutting through the heavy tension. Clara, who had been called in to clear a spilled drink from the mahogany table, spoke without looking up. "Please, sir, don't sign." In that room of lethal silence, it cracked like a gunshot. Every head turned. A young woman stood in the corner near the door that led to the service hallway. Her cleaning uniform was black and worn at the cuffs. Brown hair was tied back in a hurried knot. Loose strands stuck to her damp forehead. Her hands, roughened fingers with short-cut nails, still clutched a wet rag. But her eyes, those green eyes, were not looking at anyone in the room. They were locked onto the paper on the table, as if she had seen something no one else had noticed. Raymond Holt shot to his feet, his voice sharp as a blade. "Who are you? This is a private meeting. Security, get her out." Heavy footsteps sounded from the hallway. 2 guards appeared, hands already resting at their belts. But Caleb Thorne did not move. He looked at the girl, and he looked for a long time, half angered by the reckless interruption, half intrigued because for the first time in weeks, someone in that room was not trying to sell him something. "Wait." One word, and the entire room froze. Caleb set the pen down. His gaze never left her. "Which number do you think is wrong?" She swallowed, her chest rising and falling, but she did not retreat. She stepped closer, each step trembling yet unbroken, until she stood beside the table, close enough for the scent of cheap soap on her skin to mingle with the expensive cigars and whiskey in the air. She pointed to a line in the contract. Her voice shook, yet every word landed clear as crystal. Clause 7B, the debt from the East Boston warehouse deal. She paused, eyes fixed on Caleb. "This number is wrong. Wrong by a lot." Silence followed. A silence so heavy, it felt you could hear the city breathing beneath the glass floors. Raymond Holt gave a contemptuous laugh. "You're a cleaning girl. What do you know about complex international contracts?" "I know how to read numbers," the girl cut in, her voice suddenly steadier. "And I know when numbers lie." Caleb Thorne's hand, which had hovered above the signature line, slowly lowered, not to sign, but to fold the contract shut. The Moretti representative frowned. Raymond Holt went pale, and in that moment, stretched tight as a wire, everyone in the room understood that one tiny error could decide whether the empire collapsed tonight, or whether the whole truth was waiting to be dragged into the light. The cleaning girl still stood there, still gripping the wet rag. But for the first time in her life, someone was truly seeing her. Before we go into the full story, if you want to know what secret is about to be exposed, please hit like to support this video. Share it with the friend you think will love stories like this. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next destiny-changing moment. Caleb Thorne rose. Slowly. Every movement seemed measured down to the second. He looked at no one except the girl standing beside the table. The girl with calloused hands and a wet cleaning rag still clenched like the only weapon she had. "Get out." 2 words. Not loud, but the room felt as though the air had been sucked from it. Raymond Holt opened his mouth as if to say something, but Caleb turned his eyes on him. Just one look. Nothing more was needed. Raymond shut his mouth, his jaw grinding so hard the muscle at his temple twitched. He stood, dragging his chair back with a dry, scraping sound. The two attorneys hurriedly gathered their papers. The Moretti representatives exchanged a look, and then left in silence as well. Frank Castellano, the loyal bodyguard who had stood in the corner since the beginning, was the last to go. Before he closed the door, he looked at Clara once more, his gaze heavy, not with hatred, but with warning. The door swung shut. The room held only two people. Caleb walked slowly toward the window. Outside, Boston lay still under the night, lights blinking like millions of eyes watching. He didn't turn back to her, but his voice carried clearly through the quiet. "Who are you?" Clara swallowed. Her throat was dry and bitter. She knew where she was standing. Inside the territory of one of the most dangerous men in this city. One wrong step, one wrong answer, and she might never leave this building. "Clara Whitmore," she said, her voice smaller than she wanted. "I work the night shift here. Cleaning." Caleb stayed with his back to her. What does a cleaning worker know about Clause 7B? Clara drew a deep breath. This was the moment she had to choose. Lie and walk away safe, or tell the truth and face whatever came next. "I used to study forensic accounting," she said, "at Boston University. In my third year, I had to stop." Caleb turned around. For the first time since everyone had left, he looked straight into her eyes. Those steely irises were sharp as knives, trying to read every thought in her head. "Why did you stop?" Clara felt her chest tighten. A simple question, but the answer was not. She didn't want to say it. Not here, not with this man. "Personal reasons," she replied, her tone harder. "It's not related to this." Caleb tilted his head slightly, as if weighing whether to force the answer from her. Then he let it go. "That number, are you sure it's wrong?" "I'm sure it doesn't match," Clara corrected. Clause 7B says the debt from the East Boston warehouse deal is transferred in full, but with a deal structured like that, typically only 55% is transferred immediately. The remaining 45% transfers after 5 years. Caleb said nothing. His eyes narrowed. "If I'm right," Clara continued, her voice growing steadier, "your total debt is being inflated by nearly 40%. You're being pressured to sign based on a false number." The silence stretched. Outside the door, footsteps moved back and forth. Raymond Holt was pacing like a caged animal. Through the frosted glass, Clara could see his shadow stop, then move again, stop, then move again. Caleb saw it too. "He's worried," Clara murmured, almost a whisper. Caleb didn't answer. He stepped to the table, lifted the phone, and dialed a number. "Delay everything." 48 hours, he said into the receiver. Without waiting for a response, he hung up. Immediately, the door flew open. Raymond Holt stood there, face flushed red. "Caleb, you can't delay. Moretti won't wait. We already agreed." "I haven't agreed to anything," Caleb cut in, his voice cold as ice. "I haven't signed." Raymond's gaze snapped to Clara. His eyes were like two blades driving straight through her. "You trust the word of a cleaning girl more than my 18 years. Caleb didn't answer. He only looked at Raymond, and in that look there was something Clara couldn't read. Doubt, or something deeper than that. 48 hours, Caleb repeated. "Take her to the security lounge. No one approaches her except me." Raymond stood there for a few more seconds, as if he wanted to say more, but in the end he turned away, his heavy footsteps echoing across the marble floor. Clara was alone with Caleb once again. "I don't know who you are," Caleb said, his voice low. "I don't know what you want. But if you're playing some kind of game, you'll regret it." Clara met his eyes. She didn't step back. She didn't shake. "I'm not playing any game. I just saw the wrong number." And I couldn't stay silent. Caleb studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded, a slight nod, almost too small to see. "We'll see." Caleb Thorne's private office sat on the top floor of the Obsidian, sealed off from the rest of the building like a kingdom unto itself. There were no harsh overhead lights, only soft amber lamps tucked into the corners, casting shadows across walls paneled in dark oak. Clara stepped in behind Caleb, and it felt as though she'd passed through a gate into another world. The door clicked shut behind her, and silence settled over them both like a heavy blanket. Caleb didn't take the leather chair behind his desk. Instead, he stood at the wide window, his back to her, looking out at the city drowned in night. Clara remained where she was, unsure whether she should sit or stand, unsure whether she should speak or stay quiet. At last, Caleb's voice filled the room, low and unhurried, as if he were weighing every word before he let it go. "Do you understand what you just did?" Clara swallowed. "I said what I saw." "You stepped into the middle of a game board without knowing the rules," Caleb said, turning, those piercing gaze driving straight into her. "You could die. Right now. No one knows you're here. No one would ask." Clara felt her heartbeat quicken, but she didn't step back. "I know. Then why?" The question was simple, but it hung in the air like a sentence waiting to be carried out. Why? Clara had asked herself that hundreds of times, since the moment she'd opened her mouth in that meeting room. Why hadn't she stayed silent like she always did? Why hadn't she lowered her head, pretended she hadn't seen anything, and continued living her invisible life? She closed her eyes for a second, and her father's face rose up, so clear it was as if he stood right in front of her. Thomas Whitmore, a gentle man with the same green eyes she'd inherited. He had been an accountant for a small construction company outside Boston. Not wealthy, not powerful, just a father who worked hard to provide for his wife and 2 daughters. And then one day everything collapsed. He was accused of embezzlement. The evidence piled up. Witnesses appeared. And before he could even understand what was happening, he was standing in court like a criminal. Clara remembered sitting in that courtroom, 22 years old, her hand locked around her mother's. She remembered staring at the file of accusations when the lawyer set it on the table. And she remembered seeing a number that was wrong. A small number buried deep inside dozens of pages. But it didn't match. It wasn't right. She had been about to speak. She had opened her mouth. And then she'd seen the eyes around her, the cold faces, the expensive suits, the voices heavy with authority. And she had gone quiet. She'd told herself she was only a student. She'd told herself she might be wrong. She'd told herself someone else would speak up. No one did. Her father was sentenced to 3 years in prison. 6 months later, he hanged himself in his cell. My father died because I stayed silent. Clara opened her eyes, her voice shaking but refusing to stop. He was framed. I saw the mistake in the case file, but I was too afraid to speak. I thought I wasn't important enough. I thought no one would listen. She paused, drawing in a deep breath to hold back the choke rising in her throat. He took his own life in prison, and every day since then, I've lived with the thought that if I'd been just a little braver, if I'd spoken up, maybe he'd still be alive. The room sank into silence. Caleb stood motionless, his face unchanged, but something in those stormy gaze had shifted. The cold edge was still there, yet beneath it, Clara saw something else. Understanding, or maybe pain. "I was 19 when my father was taken from me," Caleb said, his voice a cold shadow. "I stood there and watched. I wasn't fast enough, not strong enough. I've lived with that silence for nearly 2 decades. Caleb moved toward her, each step slow, as if he were walking through a dream, and every day since then, I've asked myself what I could have done differently. He stopped only a few steps away. Their eyes met, not the gaze of a kingpin and a cleaning woman, but the gaze of 2 people carrying the same kind of scar. "You spoke up because you don't want to repeat that mistake," Caleb said. It wasn't a question. It was a fact. Clara nodded, her eyes burning, but she didn't cry. "I couldn't save my father, but I'll never stay silent again, even if it kills me." Caleb looked at her longer than anyone ever had. Then he gave a slow nod, as if he'd just made an important decision. "All right, Clara Whitmore," he said. "I'll give you one chance to prove it." Caleb walked to his desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out a thick file. He set it on the desktop with a dry, heavy thud, then turned to Clara. "This is every financial record Thorne has from the past 5 years. Every transaction, every contract, every expense," he said, his voice low and unyielding. "I want you to go through it page by page. Find anything abnormal, any number that doesn't line up, any suspicious pattern." Clara looked at the file, then back at Caleb. She understood what he was offering. This wasn't cleaning work. This was an investigation. A quiet investigation into the people closest to him. "If I find something," she asked slowly, "what will you do?" "That's my job," Caleb said. "Your job is to find. Just find." He stepped closer, gray eyes fixed on hers as if he were reading every thought in her head. "But there are conditions." Clara waited. She knew nothing in this world was free, especially not in the world of men like Caleb Thorne. "You'll live here, inside my protected wing. You won't go out. You won't contact anyone outside, Caleb said, each word as precise as a contract being read aloud. No phone, no email, no meetings. Not until the work is done. Clara felt her chest tighten. No outside contact. That meant no talking to Ivy, her younger sister, a 19-year-old in college, who believed her older sister was just an ordinary cleaning worker. It meant no calling the nursing home, where her mother lay with empty eyes and a shattered heart since the day her father was taken. What about my family? Clara asked, her voice smaller than she wanted. My mother is sick. My sister needs tuition money. Caleb's expression didn't change. I'll handle it. The money will be transferred on time. No one will know where it comes from. He paused for a moment. You'll be paid 10 times your cleaning wage. Every week. 10 times. Clara did the math in her head. That money would cover her mother's care. It would keep Ivy from having to worry about tuition. It would let Clara breathe a little easier after years of drowning in debt. But that wasn't why she would agree. I agree, Clara said, her voice steadier than she expected. Not for the money, because I want the truth. Caleb studied her for a moment longer, as if searching for any trace of a lie. Then he nodded. All right. At that moment, the office door opened. Frank Castellano stepped in, his face cold as stone. He didn't even look at Clara. His eyes locked on Caleb. What are you doing? Frank asked, his voice low and tight. Tell me I didn't hear that right. You're going to let this girl get access to our financial records? Yes, Caleb said simply. Frank moved closer, lowering his voice as if he feared Clara might hear, even though she stood only a few steps away. Do you know who she is? Do you know where she came from? On the most important night, at the most important minute, a cleaning worker suddenly jumps in and says the number is wrong. He shook his head, suspicion written across his face. Don't you see how perfect that is? How convenient. She could be a spy. Moretti could have planted her here a long time ago, waiting for the right moment to strike. Clara felt heat rush into her face. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, but she knew anything she said right now would only make Frank more suspicious. She stayed still and waited. Caleb didn't answer at once. He looked at Frank, then at Clara, then back at Frank. Finally, he spoke, his calm so flat it was chilling. She could be a spy. She could also be the only person in that room who actually saw what I missed. He walked to the window, turning his back on them both. 2 decades, Frank. For nearly 2 decades, I trusted Raymond. I let him touch every dollar I had. And tonight, a cleaning girl saw something that escaped even my steely gaze. Frank fell silent, his jaw clenched. Right or wrong, I'll know, Caleb said, turning and meeting Frank's eyes. If she's a spy, I'll handle it myself. But if she's right, he didn't finish. He didn't have to. Frank and Clara both understood that what he left unsaid was far more frightening than anything spoken aloud. The room Caleb set aside for Clara was tucked deep within the protected wing of the estate. A small space but fully furnished, with a desk, a narrow single bed, and a window that looked out onto the back garden, though Clara barely saw that garden at all. From the very first day, she buried herself in a mountain of files, stacked as high as a hill, her eyes locked on the numbers until they began to dance before her like ghosts. The first day passed, then the second, then the third. And Clara worked 16 hours a day, sometimes more. She woke while it was still dark, brewed a cup of black coffee with no sugar, and sat down at the desk, leaving it only when her vision blurred and the numbers started to overlap into a tangled chaos. Then she slept a few hours, woke again, and kept going. 5 years of records, thousands of pages, hundreds of transactions, and every number was a piece of a puzzle. While Clara tried to see the full picture someone had worked hard to keep hidden. On the 4th day, Caleb allowed her to make a phone call. Only one. 5 minutes. Supervised. And Clara held the receiver with shaking hands, her heart hammering as she listened to the ring. Clara, her sister Ivy's voice came through, young and threaded with worry. Where have you been? I've been calling for days and you haven't answered. I've been so scared. Clara closed her eyes, forcing down the guilt rising in her chest. I'm okay, Ivy. I'm away for work. A special project. The phone service isn't very good. Work, Ivy repeated, suspicious. Does a cleaning company send people away for work? Clara bit her lip. Her sister was smart, always smart. It's a new project, Clara said. I can't explain much, but I'll be home soon. Just focus on school. I sent this month's tuition. Right. I got it, Ivy said. But you. I have to go, Ivy. I love you. Take care of yourself. Clara ended the call before Ivy could ask anything else. She sat there for a long time, staring at the darkened screen, feeling as though she'd swallowed a piece of ice. She hated lying, especially lying to Ivy. But what choice did she have? Tell the truth, that she was inside a Mafia kingpin's estate, digging through finances for an underground organization, and that she could die at any moment if someone decided she'd seen too much. Clara shook her head, pushed the thought away, and turned back to the mountain of files. On the 5th day, she found her first lead. A transaction from 3 years earlier, the deal to acquire the East Boston warehouse, the same one she had seen in the contract that night, Clause 7B, that she'd pointed out to Caleb. But now, comparing the original record, the hard copy with handwritten signatures, to the digital record in the computer system, she saw something that made her blood turn cold. The two versions didn't match. The original stated clearly that 55% of the debt transferred immediately, with the remaining 45% after 5 years. But the digital version, the one Raymond Holt used to calculate Thorne's total debt, stated that 100% transferred immediately. Someone had altered it. Someone with high-level access in the system had changed the number, inflated the debt, and created a false financial picture that made Caleb Thorne believe he was standing on the edge of ruin. Clara documented everything. Her hand trembled as she wrote, but her mind stayed cold and clear. This was only one transaction. She needed more. She needed a pattern. She needed to prove it wasn't a single mistake, but a system. Night fell, then night fell again, and Clara stopped being able to tell day from night. She knew only the numbers, the pages, and the dry scratch of pencil on paper, until one night, around 3 o'clock in the morning, when the entire estate was drowned in silence, Clara was reading a file, her eyes so heavy it felt as though weights had been hung from her lids. She blinked once, then twice, and then she didn't open them again. Her head lowered slowly to the desk, her cheek resting on the stack of papers, her breathing even and soft. She didn't hear the door open. She didn't hear the quiet footsteps on the wooden floor. She didn't know how long Caleb Thorne stood in the doorway, watching her sleep among the piles of files, her lips slightly parted, ink still smudged on her fingertips. He stayed there for a long moment. Then he moved closer, silent as a shadow, and draped his black coat, still warm with his body heat, over her shoulders. Clara didn't wake. She only shifted faintly, pulling the coat closer without thinking, as if it were the blanket she'd slept under as a child. Caleb watched her for a little longer. In the darkness, his face wasn't as cold as it usually was. Something softer lived in those smoke-colored eyes, something he didn't want to admit even to himself. Then he turned away, stepped out, and closed the door with the gentleness of someone afraid of waking her. The next morning, when Clara woke with her neck aching and her back stiff and sore, she saw the black coat draped over her shoulders. She knew whose it was. She recognized the scent of sandalwood and faint tobacco, a smell that had become familiar over these last days. Clara didn't say anything. She folded the coat neatly, set it on the chair, and went back to the numbers, but her cheeks were warmer than usual, and her heart beat one rhythm faster. Raymond Holt wasn't a man who was easily fooled. 18 years in the underworld had taught him how to see what others missed, how to smell danger before it appeared, and how to remove a threat before it had time to grow. So when he realized that the cleaning worker named Clara Whitmore hadn't shown up for her shift in nearly a week, his instincts rang an alarm at once. He began to ask questions, gently, quietly, with people he knew wouldn't report back to Caleb. Where was she? Who had taken her? What was she doing? The answer he got made his jaw tighten. Clara Whitmore was in the protected wing, inside Caleb's estate, working with the financial records. Raymond understood what that meant. He wasn't stupid. Caleb was investigating him, and that cleaning girl was the tool. But Raymond Holt hadn't survived 18 years in this world by panicking. He survived by controlling, by knowing everything about everyone, and so he began to investigate Clara Whitmore. It didn't take long. Clara Whitmore, 28 years old, former forensic accounting student at Boston University, dropped out in her 3rd year. Father, Thomas Whitmore, accountant, convicted of embezzlement, died by suicide in prison 6 years ago. Mother, Margaret Whitmore, currently receiving treatment at a psychiatric nursing home. Younger sister, Ivy Whitmore, 19 years old, first-year student. Raymond read the information and smiled, a cold smile that never reached his eyes. He'd found her weakness. That afternoon, while Clara was alone in the workroom, the door opened without warning. She lifted her head, thinking it was the person bringing lunch as usual, but it wasn't. Raymond Holt stood in the doorway, having utilized an old emergency override code that he'd kept secret for years, bypassing the guards who were supposed to keep the wing sealed. He moved with the quiet arrogance of a man who still owned every ghost in this building. He wore a gray suit, one hand tucked into his pocket, looking like a polished businessman stopping by an office. But his eyes weren't polished at all. They were sharp as knives, cold as ice, and they looked at Clara as if she were an insect meant to be crushed. "Miss Whitmore," Raymond said, his voice gentle in a way that was terrifying. "Or should I call you the cleaning girl?" Clara felt her spine go rigid. She set her pen down and forced her voice to stay calm. "Mr. Holt, I don't think you're allowed in here." "Oh, I'm allowed anywhere in this estate," Raymond said as he stepped in, the security lights still flickering from his unauthorized entry. "For half my life, I've walked these halls. You think your 1 week can change that?" He moved closer, each step steady as a countdown. Clara stood up, instinct pushing her not to let him hold the higher ground. "I don't think anything," she said. "I'm just doing the work I was given." "The work you were given," Raymond echoed, the mockery in his voice soft and sharp at once. "You know, I looked into you. Very interesting." He stopped only a few steps away, close enough for her to catch the expensive cologne on his skin, close enough to see the vein standing out at his temple. Thomas Whitmore. Accountant. Prisoner. Suicide. Each word hit Clara's chest like a blade. She felt the blood drain from her face, but she didn't step back. She couldn't. "Don't talk about my father," she said, her voice trembling, but there was fire in it. Raymond smiled, the smile of a snake just before it strikes. "Your father thought he was right too," he said, his tone light as a breeze and sharp as a razor. "He thought he saw the truth. He thought he could change everything." He tilted his head, those cold eyes fixed on hers. "Look how he ended up." Clara stood there as if she'd been nailed to the floor. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. Her father's image rose in her mind, alone in that cold cell, terrified and hopeless. And she hadn't been there. She hadn't saved him. Raymond watched her a moment longer, savoring the pain on her face the way a man savors a fine glass of wine. Then he turned and walked to the door. Before he left, he paused without looking back. "Be careful, Miss Whitmore. People who poke where they shouldn't tend to meet very unfortunate endings." The door closed. Clara stood alone in the room, her whole body trembling out of her control. Slowly, she sank back into the chair, both hands covering her face, and for the first time since she'd started this work, she wondered what she was doing. She wondered whether she was walking straight into the same trap that had killed her father. Raymond's threat didn't stop Clara. It made her angry. That night, after he left, Clara didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She sat down at the desk, opened the files, and worked with a kind of determination she'd never possessed before. If Raymond Holt thought he could frighten her with her father's death, then he was wrong. Her father's death wasn't something he could use to scare her. It was the reason she would never stop. 3 days later, Clara found everything. She sat in the middle of a room drowning in paperwork, her eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep, yet in her mind everything was bright as day. She had found the pattern. Not one wrong transaction, not two, but an entire intricate system built over 5 years, maybe even longer. Raymond Holt had created a network. The first step was shell companies, names that sounded perfectly legitimate, like East Sea Logistics, North America Transport, Atlantic Consulting. On paper, they were Thorne's partners, providing shipping services, maintenance, and consulting. But when Clara dug deeper, she discovered they were all hollow. No real offices, no real employees, no real services, only bank accounts that received money. The second step was phantom expenses. Every month, hundreds of thousands of dollars were transferred to these shell companies under labels like equipment maintenance fees, strategic consulting costs, contract brokerage commissions. At a glance, the expenses looked completely normal for an empire as large as Thorne's, but equipment didn't need that much maintenance. Strategic consulting didn't cost that much, and the contracts those commissions were supposedly brokering had, in fact, been signed before the commissions were ever paid. The third step was the final destination, It took Clara almost 2 days to trace the flow of money through shell companies, through intermediary accounts, through banks in the Cayman Islands, in Switzerland, in Panama, but in the end, it all ran to one place: the Moretti family, Thorne's sworn enemy. Clara totaled it up. $47 million, over 5 years. That was the amount Raymond Holt had pulled out of Thorne and fed to their enemy. $47 million and a lifetime of loyalty. Clara closed the files, stacked them into a neat pile, and went to find Caleb. She found him in the library, standing by the window as he so often did. He turned when he heard her come in, and his gray eyes swept over the stack of folders in her arms. "You found something." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Clara nodded. She walked to the table, set the files down, and began to lay it out. She spoke of the shell companies, of phantom expenses, of commissions that didn't exist. She pointed to each transfer, each number, each wire trail. She drew the full picture of a perfectly engineered siphoning machine, working in the dark for years without anyone noticing. Caleb listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't ask. He didn't react. He only stood there, gray eyes fixed on the pages, his face unchanged, as if carved from stone. When Clara reached the final destination, the Moretti family, she saw something pass across his eyes, fast as lightning, but she saw it. Pain. In total, Clara finished, her voice softer now. $47 million in 5 years, and I think this is only what I found. There may be more in the years before that. Silence followed. The library sank into a silence so heavy Clara could hear her own heart beating. Then Caleb laughed, not with amusement, but with a sound that was cold, bitter, and bone-deep. "Nearly 2 decades, he said, his voice rough, as if someone had a hand around his throat. "A lifetime of loyalty. I trusted him. I let him sit beside me in every meeting. I let him touch every dollar I had. I let him know every secret I carried." He turned away, staring out the window, his back drawn tight as wire. "He cried at my father's funeral." Caleb's voice dropped, almost a whisper. He stood beside the casket, tears running down his face, and he told me he would always be with me, that he would help me rebuild everything, that he would protect my father's legacy. He laughed again, the sound like glass breaking. And all that time, he was selling me to my enemies, piece by piece. Clara stood still, not knowing what to say. She had seen anger, fury, hunger for revenge in other people's eyes, but she had never seen what lived in Caleb Thorne's eyes now. It wasn't anger. It was ruin, the ruin of a man who had just realized that for 18 years he had been living inside a lie. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She lay on the bed, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, yet she saw nothing there except Raymond Holt's face and that cold smile of his. "Your father thought he was right too." The words kept echoing through her head like a broken song, looping again and again without mercy, and every time they returned, her father's image rose sharper, closer, more real. Clara closed her eyes, but it only made the memories more vivid. She saw her father in the prison visiting room, sitting behind the thick glass, his eyes hollowed out and his hair more than half turned gray in only a few months. He looked at her through the glass, and in his gaze something had died. Hope, faith in justice, faith in people. "I didn't do it, Clara," he had said, his voice rough and cracked. "I swear to you, I didn't do it." Clara had believed him. She had always believed him. But she had done nothing. She had seen the wrong number in the case file, and she had stayed silent. She had been afraid. Afraid of the powerful men in that courtroom, afraid of being laughed at, afraid she might be wrong. And now, 6 years later, she was in another room, facing other powerful men, and history was repeating itself. Clara sat up sharply. She couldn't stay here any longer. She couldn't keep walking this path. Raymond had been right. Her father had thought he was right, and he had died. She thought she was right, and she would die too. Or worse, Ivy would die. Her mother would die. She began to pack. There wasn't much, only a few changes of clothes, and the personal items she'd brought with her. She stuffed them into an old bag, hands shaking, vision blurred by tears she fought to hold back. She would leave. She would return to her old life, cleaning, invisible and safe. She would forget everything that had happened. She would. "Where do you think you're going?" Clara froze. She turned, and Caleb stood in the doorway, his back against the frame, arms folded across his chest. She hadn't heard him open the door. She didn't know how long he'd been there. Clara swallowed. I can't keep doing this. Caleb didn't speak. He only watched her, gray eyes unreadable. Then he stepped into the room, closed the door, and sat down in the chair beside the desk. Silence. He didn't ask why. He didn't try to persuade her to stay. He didn't threaten. He simply sat there and waited, as if he had all night to wait for her to speak. And that silence, that patience, cracked the wall Clara had been forcing herself to build for days. Raymond came to see me, she said, her voice shaking. He knows about my father, he said. He said my father thought he was right too. She stopped, drawing in a breath to hold back the sob rising in her throat, but it didn't work. Tears began to spill, one drop, then another, then streams she couldn't control. I'm scared, Clara whispered, her voice breaking. I'm scared I'll die like my father. I'm scared I'll drag Ivy and my mother into this. I'm scared I'm repeating my father's mistake, thinking I can change something when really I'm just... She couldn't finish. She folded in on herself, both hands covering her face, her shoulders shaking in waves. Years of holding it in, years of pretending she was strong, years of carrying it alone, all of it broke in this one moment. Then she felt a hand touch her face. Warm, gentle. Caleb had knelt in front of her without her realizing, one hand lifting her chin, the other wiping the tears from her cheeks. She looked into his eyes, and in that instant she didn't see the cold Mafia kingpin. She saw a man with scars of his own. I told you about my father, Caleb said, his voice low and deep, but I haven't told you what I did. He sat down on the floor right in front of her, close enough that their knees nearly touched. I was 19. We were having dinner at my family's restaurant, a small place in North Boston. My father, my mother, and me. Uncle Marcus, the man my father called his brother, was there too. He paused, drawing in a slow breath. Then he pulled out a gun. Clara stopped breathing. I saw the gun. I knew what was about to happen. But I didn't move fast enough. Caleb's voice turned rough. 7 shots. He shot my father 7 times. Right in front of me. Right in front of my mother. And I just stood there. I just stood there and watched my father go down. He met Clara's eyes, and in his gaze there was an abyss of pain. Every day I ask myself if I'd been 1 second faster, if I'd thrown myself between them, if I'd done something, anything, would my father still be alive? He lifted a hand and touched the faint scar along the left side of his jaw. The 8th bullet, the only one that missed. It grazed my face when I finally jumped in. They sat there in that small room, deep in the night, sharing pain they had never spoken aloud to anyone else. You're not weak because you're afraid, Clara, Caleb said, and his voice softened in a way she'd never heard from him before. You're brave because you still get up even when you're afraid. He took her hand, his large warm palm closing around her smaller calloused fingers. You don't have to be strong by yourself. You only have to be strong long enough for me to finish this. Clara looked at him, tears still shining on her cheeks, and for the first time since she'd stepped into this world, she felt like she wasn't alone anymore. 3 o'clock in the morning. The estate was drowned in darkness and silence. Clara lay on the bed, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. After her conversation with Caleb, she hadn't cried again. She also hadn't packed another thing, but she still couldn't sleep. Her head was too loud. Too many thoughts spinning in circles like a storm that refused to break apart. In the end, she gave in. She climbed out of bed, pulled on a thin sweater, and went downstairs to the kitchen. Maybe a hot cup of tea would make it easier to sleep. The kitchen in the estate was as wide as a small restaurant, with dark oak cabinets and polished marble counters. But when Clara stepped inside, she realized she wasn't the only one awake tonight. Caleb stood by the stove with his back to her. He wore a simple black t-shirt and loose pants, nothing like the kingpin in a 3-piece suit she'd grown used to seeing. In front of him, a small pot was boiling hard, and in his hand was a packet of instant noodles. Clara stopped in the doorway, unsure whether she should go in or turn around. Caleb turned as if he'd known she was there all along. Can't sleep either, he asked, his voice lighter than usual. Clara nodded and stepped into the kitchen. You're making instant noodles, she asked, unable to hide the surprise in her voice. Caleb shrugged. Old habit. When I was a kid, whenever I couldn't sleep, my mother would come down to the kitchen and make noodles for me. He tore open the packet and dropped the noodles into the boiling water. She said instant noodles at 3 in the morning were magic. They made everything look less frightening. Clara gave a small smile and moved a little closer. My mother made congee, she said, chicken congee with scallions. Whenever I was sick or sad, she'd cook it and sit beside me until I finished every bite. Caleb looked at her, a flicker of curiosity passing through his eyes. Can she still cook? Clara shook her head, the smile on her lips dimming. No. Since my father died, she hasn't been herself. He nodded and didn't ask anything more. The silence between them didn't feel heavy the way it used to. It felt lighter, easier. Caleb picked up another packet of noodles and looked at her as if asking. Clara nodded. He dropped the second packet into the pot. They stood side by side in the large kitchen, watching the noodles slowly soften in the boiling water, and somehow that moment felt strangely peaceful. My mother was a terrible cook, Caleb said suddenly, and there was something in his voice, something softer than Clara had ever heard. But there was one thing she made better than anyone in the world: grilled cheese. Simple, just bread, butter, and cheese. But she always toasted it until the cheese was melted and the edges were crisp. He paused as if he were slipping into a memory. Every Sunday morning, she'd make grilled cheese for the whole family. My father read the paper, I did my homework, and my mother sang in the kitchen. His voice dropped. After my father died, she never made it again. Clara looked at him, her heart tightening. She understood that feeling. She understood when a food became a memory too painful to touch. Maybe one day, she said gently, you can make it yourself, not to replace her, just to remember her. Caleb looked at her, and in that instant she saw a small smile appear on his mouth. Not the cold smile or the mocking one she'd seen before, but a real smile, warm and human. Maybe, he said. Then he ladled the noodles into 2 bowls and set one in front of Clara. And for now, 3 o'clock instant noodles. Clara looked at the steaming bowl, then back at Caleb, and she laughed. For the first time in weeks, she laughed for real. The sound was soft in the empty kitchen, and in that moment, they weren't a mafia boss and a cleaning girl. They were just 2 people eating instant noodles at 3 in the morning, sharing the broken pieces of their memories. And somehow, it was the most normal thing either of them had felt in a very long time. Raymond Holt didn't sit still and wait to die. The moment he realized Caleb was investigating him, the moment he understood that the cleaning girl was digging into secrets he'd buried for years, Raymond moved. He reached out to Anthony Moretti that very night, through a private line no one in the Thorne organization even knew existed. The call was brief, only a few minutes, but it was enough to set everything in motion. Caleb knows, Raymond said. We need to move the plan up. And Moretti agreed. In the days that followed, things began to collapse like a house made of playing cards. Rumors spread through Boston's underworld with the speed of fire in dry grass. Caleb Thorne is losing control, people whispered in dim bars and sealed meeting rooms. He threw Raymond Holt out of a meeting. He delayed signing with Moretti at the last minute. He's listening to a cleaning girl. Every rumor carried a grain of truth, and that was what made them dangerous. Thorne's partners started to panic. Calls went unanswered. Meetings were postponed. Deals that had been inching toward signatures suddenly stalled with no end in sight. One of Thorne's largest suppliers phoned Frank Castellano, his voice tight with worry. Frank, what's happening? I'm hearing Caleb's got problems. Frank didn't know what to say, because he was asking himself the same question. Inside the Thorne organization, the air was even sharper. Suspicious glances. Conversations that died mid-sentence when Clara walked past. Whispers loud enough for her to hear. Quiet enough that no one had to own them. Who is she to step into our business? Funny timing, isn't it? She shows up on the most important night. I heard she's got trouble in her family. Her father was a criminal. Clara felt as if she were walking down a road with people lined on both sides, pointing and murmuring as she passed. She tried not to care. She tried to focus on the work. But the isolation seeped into her the way water soaks into cloth. Slow at first, then everywhere. One afternoon, as Clara crossed the hallway, she heard Frank Castellano's voice from the room beside it. I don't know, Caleb. She showed up too perfectly, too right on time. Are you sure she's not one of Moretti's? Clara stopped, her chest tightening. Frank, the man she'd thought was starting to accept her, the man who'd nodded at her in the corridor that morning, even he was doubting. Everything she found could have been planted information, Frank's voice went on. Raymond could be playing a bigger game, using her to make you doubt the people closest to you, while the one you really should doubt is her. Silence. Clara didn't hear Caleb answer, and that silence hurt more than any words. She turned away and walked quickly back to her room, fighting not to let the tears fall. That night, Clara sat alone in the small room, staring out at a window filled with darkness. She wasn't the invisible cleaning girl anymore, but she didn't belong to this world either. She was caught in the middle, with no allies, nowhere to lean. Her mother was in a nursing home, not knowing where her daughter was. Ivy thought she was away on a work assignment, not knowing her sister was living inside a Mafia boss's estate. And the one person Clara had believed she could trust, the man who'd draped his coat over her shoulders, who'd wiped her tears, who'd eaten instant noodles with her at 3 a.m, that man was staying silent while his own lieutenant called her a spy. Clara wrapped her arms around a pillow and curled into the corner of the bed. For the first time since this began, she felt completely, absolutely alone. The next morning, Caleb summoned the entire leadership of the Thorn organization. No warning, no explanation, just one short message delivered to each of them at 6 o'clock in the morning. Main conference room. 9 o'clock. Mandatory. When Clara received the same message, she didn't know what she was supposed to feel. Hope, fear, or maybe just exhaustion. She put on the most presentable clothes she had, a white button-down shirt and black slacks that someone had left outside her door that morning. She didn't know who had sent them, but she knew it wasn't an accident. The main conference room of the Thorn estate was a large space with a long wooden table that could seat 20 people. When Clara walked in, she saw nearly every chair already filled. Men in expensive suits, faces hard with power, eyes turning toward her with every kind of emotion: curiosity, suspicion, contempt, hostility. Raymond Holt sat in the middle of the table, directly opposite Caleb's position. When he saw Clara, his eyes darkened like a sky before a storm, but he didn't say anything. Not yet. Caleb stood at the head of the table, back straight, expression blank. He motioned for Clara to stand beside him. "Today," Caleb began, his voice carrying through the room, "we're going to hear a report on the Thorn organization's finances over the past 5 years." Raymond stood immediately. "Caleb, this is a farce. You're going to let a cleaning girl stand in front of the leadership and talk about our finances." "She studied forensic accounting," Caleb said, his voice not shifting by even a fraction. "And she spent the last 2 weeks reviewing every transaction we've made." 2 weeks, Raymond scoffed. "I've managed this organization's finances for 18 years. You think her 2 weeks compares to that kind of experience?" "I don't think," Caleb said, meeting Raymond's eyes without blinking. "I want to hear." The room went silent. Raymond sat back down slowly, jaw clenched, his stare on Clara like twin knives. Caleb turned to her and gave a small nod. This was her moment. Clara drew a deep breath and stepped forward. She could feel every pair of eyes pressing on her shoulders like stones, but she didn't retreat. She hadn't retreated that night in the meeting room, and she wouldn't retreat now. "Over the last 5 years," Clara began, her voice trembling slightly but clear, "a total of $47 million has flowed out of the Thorn organization through a system of phantom transactions." She opened the file in front of her, turning pages one by one. "This system includes 12 shell companies, all registered under names that sound professional, but have no real offices, no real employees, and provide no real services." A man at the far end of the table, gray-haired with a stern face, sat up straighter. Harrison Cross, 60 years old, one of the organization's oldest members, a friend of Caleb's father. "Do you have proof of what you're saying?" he asked, his tone neither hostile nor warm. Clara nodded. "Yes, sir." She turned more pages and produced a comparison chart. "This is the original record for the East Boston warehouse acquisition, the copy with handwritten signatures, and this is the digital record in the system. These two versions are not the same. The original states clearly that only 55% of the debt transferred immediately. The digital version says 100%. She looked around the room. Someone altered the system record to inflate the organization's debt. Raymond stood again, his face flushed. "She's making this up. She could have altered those records herself to frame me." "I don't have access to the system," Clara said, her tone steady. "Only 2 people have the highest level access, Mr. Thorne and you." The room began to murmur. Harrison Cross lifted a hand, signaling for silence. "You said the money went where?" he asked. "The Moretti family," Clara answered. The murmurs rose into noise. Some men stood, Others turned to stare at Raymond in shock. Raymond shook his head, his voice climbing higher. Ridiculous. Completely ridiculous. I've served this family for 18 years. I'm not going to sit here and listen to a cleaning girl accuse me. Harrison Cross looked at Clara, his eyes sharp. Do you have final proof? Something undeniable, Clara nodded. She flipped to the last page in the file and laid it on the table. This is a transfer from 3 days ago. $2 million moved from Thorn funds to an account in the Cayman Islands. That account belongs to a subsidiary company of the Moretti family. She looked straight at Raymond. This transfer happened after Mr. Thorn delayed signing the contract, after I pointed out the discrepancy, as if someone was trying to move money out before being caught. Silence. The room sank into a heavy quiet where every breath could be heard. Raymond stood there, his face pale as paper. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Harrison Cross rose slowly, staring at Raymond with an expression Clara couldn't read. Then he turned to Caleb. I think we need to verify this information, he said. His voice waited. Immediately, the meeting ended in chaos, in murmurs and suspicious looks, in an atmosphere heavy as the air before a storm. As people began to file out, Raymond Holt remained standing, motionless as a stone statue. His eyes stayed locked on Caleb, and in that gaze, something was burning. Not the fear of a man exposed, but the fury of a man who believed he'd been betrayed. When the room was nearly empty, when only Caleb, Clara, Frank, and Harrison Cross remained, Raymond finally spoke. 18 years. His voice was low and trembling, not from fear, but from rage held tight. For nearly 20 years, I stood beside you. I helped you rebuild everything after your father died. I stayed up nights with you, planned with you, fought beside you. He stepped closer to Caleb, jaw clenched so hard the muscle at his temple jumped. And now you believe the word of a cleaning girl who appeared out of nowhere over my 18 years. Caleb didn't take a single step back. His unyielding stare met Raymond's, cold and steady. I don't believe her word, Raymond, Caleb said, his calm almost frightening. I believe the numbers, and numbers don't lie. Raymond let out a laugh, bitter and sharp. Numbers can be changed. Evidence can be manufactured. Don't you see how perfect this is? She shows up at exactly the right moment, says exactly the right thing, and now you're pushing away the man closest to you. I'm not pushing anyone away, Caleb said. I'm looking for the truth, and if you're innocent, you have nothing to fear. The two men stood facing each other, the air between them drawn so tight it felt like it could be cut with a knife. At last, Raymond took one step back. He straightened his suit collar, as if trying to regain control of himself. Fine, Caleb. If you want to trust a stranger more than the man who's been at your side for half your life, that's your choice. He turned and walked toward the door, but as he passed Clara, he stopped. Only for a second, just long enough to tilt his head toward her and whisper, so softly only she could hear. You'll die like your father. Clara went rigid as if an electric current had hit her. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The words drove into her like a cold blade, straight into the deepest wound inside her. Raymond didn't look back. He walked out, and the door shut behind him with a sound that echoed through the empty room. Clara stood there, shaking, not hearing what Frank was saying to Caleb, not noticing the concern on Harrison Cross's face. She heard only the roar of blood in her ears and the pounding of her heart, as if it wanted to break free from her ribs. That night, while Clara sat alone in her room, her phone vibrated, a message from an unknown number. No words, only 2 photographs. The first was her mother, Margaret Whitmore, sitting in a wheelchair in the nursing home garden, her empty eyes fixed on nothing at all. The photo was taken from far away, as if the person behind the lens had been hiding in the bushes, watching. The second was Ivy, her sister walking along the path toward her dorm, headphones on, smiling at something on her phone. She had no idea someone was watching her. Clara stared at the photos, and the world around her seemed to collapse. No threat was needed, no explanation. The message was brutally clear. I know where they are. I can reach them any time. And if you don't stop, they'll pay. Clara pressed the phone to her chest, tears running down her cheeks. She wanted to call Ivy, to hear her sister's voice, to know she was safe, but she couldn't. She wasn't allowed to contact anyone outside. She was trapped inside this estate, powerless, while her enemy threatened the people she loved most. That night, Raymond Holt vanished. When Caleb's men went to his apartment to keep watch, they found only an empty room. No clothes, no documents, no trace. As if he had never existed at all, Caleb stood in the middle of the empty apartment, gray eyes sweeping every corner. "He prepared for this a long time ago," Frank said, his voice heavy. He knew this day would come. Caleb didn't answer. He only stood there, jaw clenched, staring into the space where Raymond Holt had stood for 18 years. And in the darkness, he wondered how many signs he'd missed all those years. Clara stormed into Caleb's office the very next morning, her eyes red and swollen from crying all night, her hands still clenched around the phone with the threatening photos. "I need to see my family," she said, her voice shaking but full of resolve. Right now, Caleb stood by the window with his back to her. He didn't turn around, but his voice carried clearly through the room. "No, you don't understand." Clara stepped closer, tears starting to spill again. "Raymond is threatening them. He sent me pictures of my mother and Ivy. He knows where they are. I have to." "You'll lead him to them," Caleb said, turning, gray eyes locked on hers. "If you leave here right now, if you run to them, you'll draw a straight line for Raymond right to their front door." Clara stopped, the words choking in her throat. She knew he was right. She knew Raymond was waiting for exactly that. But how could she sit still while the people she loved were in danger? "Then what am I supposed to do?" she whispered, desperation cracking her voice. "Sit here and wait while he hurts them." Caleb didn't answer at once. He walked to the desk, picked up the phone, and dialed. Clara stood there, not understanding what he was doing, until he began to speak. "Frank, give me a status report." A pause while he listened, then he nodded. "Good. Keep it that way. Don't take your eyes off them." He hung up and turned back to Clara. "Your mother was moved to a new medical facility this morning. High-level security. No one knows the address except my people." She stared at him, not sure she'd heard correctly. "Ivy is in a new dorm," Caleb continued. "She thinks it's a scholarship that includes better housing. Security 24/7. Someone watching every time she goes out." Clara stood there with her mouth slightly open, unable to speak. He'd done all of that. When? How? Why? "I don't," she stammered. "I didn't know." "You don't need to know," Caleb said, his voice softer than usual. "You only need to know they're safe." Clara looked at him, and a question slipped off her lips before she could stop it. "Why?" Caleb was silent for a moment. He turned back to the window, and when he spoke, his voice carried something Clara had never heard from him before. "Because you saved me when you had no reason to." Clara stepped closer, her heart beating harder. "I didn't save you. I just saw the wrong number." "You spoke up," Caleb said, turning to face her. "In that room, among men who could have had you killed with a nod, you spoke up. Not because you stood to gain anything, not because someone paid you, but because you couldn't stay silent in the face of something wrong." He moved closer, and Clara realized it was the first time they stood this near without a desk or a stack of files between them. "Do you know the last time anyone did that for me?" he asked, his voice dropping. "It was my father, 18 years ago." Clara looked at him, and in that moment she didn't see the cold Mafia boss. She saw a man who'd lost too much, trusted the wrong people too many times, and been alone for too long. Without thinking, she lifted her hand and touched the faint scar along the left side of his jaw. Caleb went still, his breath catching. No one had touched him like this in years. No one dared. "This scar," Clara whispered, her fingertip tracing the faint ridge. "You said it came from the 8th bullet, the one that grazed you when you jumped in to save your father." Caleb swallowed, his throat tightening. "I jumped in too late." "You tried," Clara said, her voice as soft as breath. "You were 19, watching your father get shot, and you still tried. That isn't failure. That's courage." Caleb looked down at her, and his gray eyes weren't cold anymore. Something in them was melting, a wall giving way, a wound being touched for the first time in a long time. "You're not afraid of me," he said, not a question, but a statement filled with surprise. Clara shook her head slightly. "I'm afraid of a lot of things, but you aren't one of them." They stood there in the empty room, the distance between them down to only a few centimeters. Clara hadn't pulled her hand away. Caleb hadn't stepped back. Time seemed to stop. Then Caleb's phone rang, shattering the moment. He drew in a slow breath, stepped back once, and answered. Clara stood there, her hand still warm from the heat of his skin, her heart beating so fast she thought the room might hear it. She didn't know what had just happened between them. She only knew something had shifted, and there was no way back to what it had been before. The ultimatum arrived the next morning, not by letter or email, but as a black box left at the estate gate, and inside it lay a silver bullet and a handwritten note that read, 48 hours, sign or war, A.M. Caleb stood in the conference room, watching the bullet roll back and forth across the glass tabletop. Anthony Moretti, the boss of the rival family, had run out of patience, and Raymond Holt was hiding under his protection, pouring fuel on the fire, whispering lies into Moretti's ear to rush the war he'd been planting for years. An emergency meeting was called within 1 hour, and this time the room wasn't silent like before. It was loud, chaotic, full of overlapping voices. "We have to sign," a senior member said, his voice tight with worry. "Moretti's got twice our numbers. A war right now is suicide. Signing is surrender," Frank Castellano shot back. "It means handing the port to him, handing over everything Caleb's father built." "Caleb's father is dead," the other man replied. "And if we're not careful, we'll all be dead too." The arguments kept exploding. Some sided with Frank, some wanted negotiation. The Thorn organization was splitting, and with every second that passed, the crack grew deeper. Clara sat in the corner, listening to everything. She had no right to speak in this meeting. She was only an outsider, a cleaning girl Caleb had allowed to sit here. But in her mind, an idea was forming. A mad idea. Dangerous, but maybe the only way out of this dead end. When the arguing dipped for a moment, Clara stood. Every eye turned to her, some startled, some irritated. "I have a proposal," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Harrison Cross raised an eyebrow. "You have a proposal." His tone wasn't mocking, but it wasn't friendly either. Clara nodded. "We don't need to sign, and we don't need a war. We need to talk to Moretti." A few men let out scoffing laughs. One man shook his head. "Talk to Moretti. You think he'll invite us for tea and discuss peace?" "No," Clara said. "I think he'll listen when he learns Raymond has been deceiving him." The room went quiet. Clara continued. "Raymond didn't just steal from Thorn. He stole from Moretti, too. In every transfer routed through the shell companies, Raymond kept 15% for himself. Moretti thinks he's paying a loyal spy, but in reality he's being hollowed out just like we are." Harrison Cross sat straighter, his expression shifting. "Do you have proof of that?" "Yes," Clara said. "I have the Zurich account, the money Raymond kept from both sides. If Moretti sees it, he'll understand his real enemy isn't Thorn. It's the man he's protecting." Caleb, who'd been silent through the entire debate, finally spoke. "No." One word, cold and final. Clara turned to him. "Caleb, you think Moretti's going to sit down and listen to you?" Caleb asked, his voice tight. "He'll kill you before you can even open your mouth." "He won't." Clara stepped closer, meeting his eyes. "Moretti is a businessman. Before he's a mafia boss, he's a businessman. And no businessman kills the person bringing information that could save him millions of dollars." Caleb stared at her, jaw clenched. Clara didn't back down. "I've got nothing to gain from this," she said, her voice softer but still unshakable. "I'm not Thorn's person. I'm not Moretti's enemy. I'm just a girl who saw the wrong numbers and wanted to speak the truth. That's exactly the kind of person Moretti will listen to." The room held its breath, waiting for Caleb's reaction. He stood there, gray eyes fixed on Clara, and she could see the war playing out inside him. Reason told him this was the only chance, but something else, something deeper, was screaming that he couldn't let her walk into the lion's den. "If you die," Caleb said, his voice low and rough, "I won't be able to do anything." Clara looked at him, and in that instant she understood he wasn't talking about strategy or planning. He was talking about something far more personal than that. "I won't die," she whispered, "but if we don't do anything, everyone will." Caleb closed his eyes, drew a long breath, and when he opened them again, Clara knew he'd made his decision. 24 hours later, everything was ready. The meeting was set at La Fontana, an Italian restaurant perched on the line between Thorn territory and Moretti territory, neutral ground, where neither side held an advantage and neither side was safe. Frank Castellano spent the entire morning checking weapons, handguns cleaned, loaded, and hidden beneath suit jackets, knives strapped tight to ankles. Every member of the escort team fully equipped, prepared for the worst case. Clara stood in her room, staring at the black dress hanging on the hook. Someone had left it outside her door that morning, along with a pair of high heels and a small handbag. She didn't know who had chosen them, but she knew they were more expensive than anything she'd ever owned in her life. She slipped into the dress, feeling strange in the soft silk that clung to her body. She stepped into the heels, wobbling through the first few steps before she found her balance. She faced the mirror and didn't recognize the person looking back. That wasn't Clara Whitmore, the cleaning girl in a worn uniform with her hair tied up in a hurry. That was someone else, a woman with sharp green eyes and the curve of a fitted black dress, a woman who looked as if she belonged in sealed boardrooms and among deadly secrets. When she came down into the main hall, people stopped to stare. Frank lifted an eyebrow, surprise he couldn't hide. Harrison Cross gave a nod of approval. But the gaze Clara felt most strongly was Caleb's. He stood by the door in his black three-piece suit as usual, but when he saw her, he went still. His gray eyes moved over her from head to toe, slowly, as if he were trying to memorize every detail. Then his gaze stopped on her eyes, and in that moment Clara saw something flash in those normally cold eyes. Something hotter, something more dangerous. Caleb didn't say anything. He only turned and walked out, but Clara noticed his jaw was clenched tighter than usual. In the car, no one spoke. Clara sat beside Caleb in the back seat, Frank in the front beside the driver. The air was so heavy it felt like it could be cut with a knife. Clara stared out the window at the streets of Boston sliding past, and tried not to think that this might be the last time she ever saw them. Her hand trembled, and she gripped her handbag to hide it. But Caleb saw. Without a word, he reached over, placed his hand on hers, and held tight. His hand was warm and steady, like an anchor keeping her from being pulled under by the rising tide of fear in her chest. Clara looked down at their intertwined hands, then up at his face. Caleb wasn't looking at her. He was staring straight ahead, expression blank. But he didn't let go. The car stopped in front of La Fontana. The restaurant looked elegant and peaceful, with a red brick facade and lush green plants flanking the door. But Clara knew appearances could lie. Behind those walls, the fate of her and everyone else was waiting to be decided. Frank opened the car door and stepped out first to scan the area. Then he nodded, signaling it was clear. Caleb released Clara's hand and got out. He turned back and offered his hand to her. Clara drew a slow breath, placed her hand in his, and stepped into the night. They walked into the restaurant together, Frank following behind like a protective shadow. Inside, the restaurant had been cleared. No diners, no waiters moving through the room, only one table in the center, and at it, Anthony Moretti sat waiting. He was a man in his 50s, gray hair slicked back, a face lined with the weather of a hard life. His dark eyes were sharp as knives, and when they swept over Caleb and then stopped on Clara, she felt as if she were being examined under glass. The air inside the restaurant was as heavy as a courtroom, and Clara knew the trial was about to begin. Caleb and Clara had barely sat down across from Moretti when the back door of the restaurant opened, and Clara's heart seemed to stop as she saw who walked in. Raymond Holt. He strode toward the table with the confidence of a man who believed he held the high ground, his mouth curving into a triumphant smile when his eyes landed on Clara. "I hear someone wants to talk about me," Raymond said, pulling out a chair and sitting down beside Moretti as if he belonged there. "I figured I should be present to defend myself." Clara felt Caleb go rigid beside her. His hand drifted toward his waist, where she knew a gun was hidden. But Moretti lifted one hand, signaling for everyone to stay calm. "I want to hear the girl speak," he said, looking at Clara with black eyes as sharp as blades, weighing her. "Raymond says you're Thorne's spy, planted to poison the relationship between us. But I like hearing both sides before I decide." Clara swallowed hard and forced her voice to hold steady. This was her only chance. If she failed, it wouldn't just be her. Caleb, and everyone waiting outside, wouldn't walk out of here alive either. "I'm not a spy," she began. "I'm just a girl who can read numbers, and the numbers I found show one thing very clearly. Raymond Holt has been deceiving both of you." Raymond gave a scoffing laugh. "Same old game. She'll wave a pile of forged papers and hope you believe her." "Quiet," Moretti said, not loud, but heavy enough that Raymond shut his mouth instantly. He kept his eyes on Clara. "Continue." Clara opened her handbag, pulled out a thin folder, and laid it on the table. "For 12 years, Raymond has been moving money from both Thorne and Moretti through a network of shell companies. Mr. Moretti, You thought you were paying a loyal spy, but in every transfer you sent through Raymond, he kept 15% for himself. Moretti's expression didn't change, but Clara saw his eyes narrow. Proof? He asked, his voice cold as ice. Clara flipped the folder open and pointed to a line of numbers. This is the Zurich bank account number. It doesn't belong to Thorne or to Moretti. It belongs to Raymond Holt personally. And it holds more than $7 million, accumulated from both sides over 12 years. Raymond sprang to his feet, his face draining pale. She's lying. She hacked the system and fabricated records. Anthony, you can't believe a cleaning girl over me, the man who served you for more than a decade. Moretti didn't look at Raymond. His gaze stayed on Clara, those dark eyes unblinking. Then he picked up his phone, dialed a number, and spoke in Italian. Clara didn't understand the words, but she heard the Zurich account number repeated. Then Moretti went silent, listening. 10 minutes passed. The longest 10 minutes of Clara's life. No one spoke. No one moved. The restaurant sank into a silence so heavy she could hear a wall clock ticking somewhere behind them. Raymond sat back down, but the confidence had drained from his face. In its place was worry. Fear he tried to hide and failed. Sweat began to bead along his forehead. At last, Moretti ended the call. He set the phone down slowly, each movement perfectly controlled. Then he turned and looked at Raymond, and in those dark eyes Clara saw death. 12 years, Moretti said, his voice low and even, like a prayer bell. 12 years I trusted you. I paid you. I protected you. And all that time, you stole from me, Raymond stammered. Anthony, I can explain. This is a misunderstanding. She's quiet, Moretti said. One word, and it cut through Raymond's excuses like a blade. You didn't just steal my money, Moretti went on, his voice growing colder. You used me like a puppet. You pushed me into a war with Thorne to hide your own crimes. You planned to let me and Caleb kill each other while you sat back and counted cash. He gestured, and 2 large men stepped out of the shadows in the corner of the restaurant. Raymond jerked up, trying to run, but they grabbed him before he could take 2 steps. Anthony, please, I can pay it back. I can explain. Please, Raymond shouted, struggling, but the 2 men dragged him away like a rag doll. Anthony. Raymond's scream echoed through the restaurant as he was hauled toward the back door, and then the door shut, and the sound vanished. Silence. Clara sat there, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. She had just watched a man get dragged toward death, and she didn't know what she was supposed to feel. Relief, fear, or only emptiness. Moretti turned back to Caleb, then to Clara, and for the first time since they'd entered, he smiled. This girl, he said, nodding toward Clara. Keep her. She's got good eyes. Moretti rose, straightened the collar of his suit, and stepped toward Caleb. In that moment, Clara didn't know what was going to happen. She held her breath, her heart beating so hard she could hear it in her ears. Then Moretti extended his hand. The contract is canceled, he said, calm, as if they'd just finished an ordinary business negotiation, instead of a confrontation that had nearly tipped into war. Thorne keeps the port. I've got no interest in fighting someone who isn't my enemy. Caleb looked at the offered hand for a moment, then took it. Thank you. Don't thank me, Moretti said, shaking his head as his eyes shifted to Clara. Thank her. She just saved both of us from a war that would have benefited only Raymond. He released Caleb's hand, gave him a brief nod, and turned to leave. Before he reached the door, he paused and spoke over his shoulder. Caleb, next time choose your people more carefully. Such a long time is too long to trust the wrong man. Then he disappeared through the doorway, leaving Caleb and Clara in the emptied restaurant. Frank appeared beside them, his face still tight. We should go. Right now. They walked out to the car in silence. Clara moved like a machine, her mind blank, her body numb. She had just watched a man get dragged toward death. She had been the one who set it in motion. Yes, Raymond deserved it. Yes, he had deceived, stolen, and threatened her family. But that didn't make the feeling any easier. In the car, no one spoke. Frank sat in front, his eyes fixed on the windows, tracking every movement outside. Caleb sat beside Clara in the back seat, expression blank, staring straight ahead. Clara looked down at her hands. They were shaking, trembling out of control, as if her body was finally catching up to everything that had just happened. She tried to clench her fingers to stop it, but it didn't work. Then a warm hand covered hers. Clara turned and saw Caleb looking at her, and his gray eyes weren't cold anymore. In them was worry, concern, and something deeper she didn't dare name. He didn't speak. He only held her hand, his fingers threading through hers, warm and steady. And somehow, it calmed her. "I don't feel like we won," Clara whispered, her voice hoarse with exhaustion. "We won, didn't we? Raymond's taken. The contract is canceled. The Thorn organization is safe. So why do I feel like this?" Caleb was silent for a long time. Then he spoke, his voice low and deep. "The truth doesn't win, Clara. It doesn't lose. It doesn't fight. It's there." He looked out the window, streetlights sliding across his face in passing streaks. And when the truth is there, everything else has to change to fit it. Sometimes that change hurts. Sometimes it's cruel. But it's necessary. Clara looked at him, and in that moment she understood why Caleb Thorne had become the man he was. He'd been forced to face the truth too many times in his life. The truth about the uncle who killed his father. The truth about Raymond, the man he'd trusted for 18 years. Every time the truth arrived, it left a scar behind, and Caleb had learned how to live with those scars. "Thank you," Clara said softly. "For being here, for holding my hand." Caleb didn't answer. He only tightened his grip a little, and they sat like that in silence the rest of the way. When the car pulled up to the estate, it was fully dark. Clara stepped out, her legs threatening to buckle after hours of strain. All she wanted was to go to her room, lie down, and sleep for a long, long time. But the moment she stepped inside and pulled out her phone, a new email notification appeared. Anonymous sender. Blank subject. Clara opened it, her heart hammering. The sender was untraceable, but the digital signature hinted at a high-level source within the Moretti organization, someone ensuring that Raymond's betrayal left no loose ends for them to deal with. There was only one line. He didn't work alone. And there was an attachment. Clara opened the file, her hands shaking. It was a screenshot of a money transfer, from Raymond's Zurich account to another account, an account she didn't recognize, but she recognized the amount. It was 15% of the 15% Raymond had been skimming. Raymond had been sharing the money with someone else, someone still out there, someone still inside the Thorn organization. Clara stood there, staring at the glowing phone screen in the dark, and she realized the shadows were deeper than they appeared. The task wasn't just to save the Empire, but to clean it from within, one traitor at a time. It was only beginning. 3 months passed like a dream. The Thorn organization slowly recovered from the ashes of betrayal, like a phoenix growing new feathers. The anonymous email Clara received that night led to an internal investigation that lasted for weeks. In the end, they found Raymond's accomplice, a low-level accountant named Morrison who had secretly worked with Raymond for 5 years. He was dealt with quietly, not as loudly as Raymond, but no less effectively. And from that point on, Caleb began rebuilding everything from the ground up. He overhauled the organization's entire financial system, and Clara stood beside him through every step. She designed new oversight procedures, created cross-checks so no one could manipulate the numbers without being caught, trained a small team to review transactions on a regular schedule, and turned suspicion into a system and honesty into a culture. One afternoon, while Clara was reviewing the monthly report in her new office, there was a knock at the door. She looked up and was surprised to see Frank Castellano standing in the doorway. The 45-year-old stepped inside, his face no longer as cold as it had been before. Instead, there was something almost like awkwardness in his eyes. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" Frank asked. Clara nodded and gestured for him to sit. But Frank didn't. He stayed standing, hands laced together in front of his chest, as if searching for the right words. "I was wrong about you," Frank finally said, his voice low and sincere. "I doubted you. I told Caleb you might be a spy. I didn't believe you, even though you did everything you could to prove you were right." He paused and drew a deep breath. "I'm sorry." Clara looked at him and felt no anger in her the way she'd expected. She felt only tiredness, and maybe understanding. "You did it to protect Caleb," she said. "I understand." Frank nodded, his expression easing. "You're a good person, Clara, and I'm glad Caleb has you." He turned to leave, but stopped at the door. "If you need anything at all, call me." Then he was gone, leaving Clara with a small smile on her lips. The following week, a meeting was held. Not an emergency meeting, not the tense kind they'd had before, but a meeting to officially recognize Clara. Harrison Cross stood and looked around the room at the familiar faces. 3 months ago, he began, this organization nearly collapsed. We almost signed away everything the previous generation built, and we almost walked into a war we couldn't win. He looked toward Clara. One person stopped that from happening, not with guns or money, but with the truth. He stepped closer, placed a hand on Clara's shoulder. You saved us, Clara Whitmore, and we won't forget it. Applause rose in the room, not loud, but genuine. Clara stood there, cheeks flushed, not knowing what to say. She only nodded, her eyes searching for Caleb in the crowd. He stood in the corner, not clapping, but his gray eyes were on her with something that looked like pride. 1 week later, Clara stood at the gate of Boston University, her heart pounding for a completely different reason. She had registered to return and finish her degree, and today was her first day meeting Professor Harold Chen again, her former mentor. He sat in a small office filled with books, his hair more gray than the last time she'd seen him 6 years ago. When he saw Clara step in, he smiled. Clara Whitmore, he said, warm. I've been following the news about you. Clara blinked, surprised. News? Oh, not the public kind, Professor Chen chuckled. But in forensic accounting circles, the story of the girl who uncovered a $47 million siphoning system has traveled pretty far. He stood, moved closer. You were the best student I ever taught. I was sad when you left. Clara lowered her eyes. I was sad too, Professor. But you didn't stop learning, Professor Chen said, resting a hand on her shoulder. You just changed classrooms. Clara looked up, her eyes burning, and for the first time in years, she felt like she was walking in the right direction. But the hardest challenge didn't come from school or the Thorn organization. It came from Ivy. Her sister showed up at the estate one afternoon, eyes red, voice shaking. You work for the Mafia? Ivy asked, wounded. I looked into my scholarship and I found where it came from. You've been lying to me for months. Clara didn't know what to say. She hadn't been ready for this confrontation. They fought. Ivy cried, shouted that she felt betrayed. Clara cried too, trying to explain she'd done everything to protect their family. They said things that hurt each other, things they would both regret later. And then, when they were both exhausted, Ivy sat down beside Clara on the living room sofa. Silence stretched. Then Ivy spoke, her voice small and drained. Are you safe? Clara looked at her sister, and the tears came again. Yes, I'm safe. Ivy nodded, then leaned her head onto Clara's shoulder. I'm still mad at you, but I also understand why you did it. Clara held her sister, and in that moment, she felt like a part of her had finally begun to heal. 1 year had passed since that fateful night. 1 year since Clara Whitmore, a cleaning girl with calloused hands, walked into a conference room and changed everything with a single sentence. Now she stood on the balcony of the Obsidian, looking down at the city of Boston drowning in night. Millions of lights flickered below like stars that had fallen to earth, and the night wind carried the first chill of approaching autumn. Clara had changed a great deal in 1 year. She finished her bachelor's degree with highest honors, became the official financial advisor of the Thorn organization, and more than anything, she learned how to trust herself. But some things didn't change, like the way she still liked to stand alone on late nights, watching the city and thinking about everything that had come before. Familiar footsteps sounded behind her, and Clara didn't need to turn to know who it was. Caleb stepped up beside her, and the two of them looked out into the dark, quiet for a moment. Exactly 1 year, Caleb said, his voice low and steady in the still night. 1 year since you stood in that meeting room and told me the number was wrong. Clara gave a small smile. 1 year since you almost signed everything away. I almost lost everything. Caleb turned to her, his shadowed gaze reflecting the city lights. Not just the port or the money, everything my father built, everything I fought to protect for 18 years. He paused, as if searching for the right words, and then you showed up. Clara turned to him, waiting. I thought I was strong, Caleb continued, his voice softer now, more honest. I thought I didn't need anyone. I built a wall around myself and called it strength. But you showed me something else. He looked straight into her eyes. I'm stronger because you came into my life. Not because you saved my organization, but because you reminded me that sometimes trusting someone isn't weakness. Sometimes it's the bravest thing we can do. Clara felt her chest tighten. She didn't know what to say. didn't know how to shape what was rising inside her into words. In the past year, she and Caleb had stood together through so much. They rebuilt the organization from the ashes of betrayal. They learned how to trust each other, how to lean on each other. But they had never talked about this, about the thing that lived between them, the looks that lasted longer than they needed to, the brushes of hands, the silences they both understood but neither dared to name. "Will you stay?" Caleb asked, his voice turning rough. "Not as an advisor, not for the work, but stay." Clara looked at him and saw something in those smoke-colored eyes she had never seen before. Vulnerability, hope, fear. Caleb Thorne, the cold Mafia boss, was standing in front of her and opening himself in a way he might never have done with anyone else. She didn't answer with words. Instead, she reached out and took his hand. Her hand was small inside his, still marked with calluses from years of labor, but it was warm, and it was steady. Caleb looked down at their intertwined fingers, then lifted his gaze back to her. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. They stood there on the balcony in the deep night, two hands holding on to each other. No kiss, no declaration, only silence and the warmth of another person's hand. And it was enough. Enough for them both to understand this wasn't the end. This was the beginning. The next morning, Clara went to visit her mother at the new medical facility. Margaret Whitmore had recovered a great deal over the past year. She no longer sat staring into nothing with empty eyes. She had begun to talk again, to laugh again, to remember. When Clara stepped into the room, her mother was sitting by the window, bathed in morning light. She turned, and her eyes brightened at the sight of her daughter. "Clara," she called, her voice warm the way Clara remembered from childhood. Clara sat beside her and took her mother's thin hand. They sat in silence for a while, looking out at the garden beyond the glass. Then Margaret spoke, her voice soft as breath. "You're like your father." Clara looked at her, eyes burning. "Mom, your father couldn't close his eyes to something wrong either." Margaret squeezed her daughter's hand tighter. "And your father would be so proud of you, the way I'm proud of you." Tears ran down Clara's cheeks. She held her mother, feeling that familiar warmth she'd thought she'd lost forever. "I miss Dad," Clara whispered. "I do too," Margaret said, stroking her daughter's hair. "But your father is still alive. In you. In the way you live. In the truth you protected." Clara closed her eyes, and for the first time in 6 years, she felt the wound inside her begin to heal. One evening, Clara returned to the Obsidian, not as a cleaning worker, not as a financial advisor, but simply as a guest, sitting in the corner of the bar with a glass of water and memories flooding her mind. She looked around the room, the place where, more than a year earlier, she had walked in wearing a worn uniform with a damp cleaning cloth in her hand, the place where she had dared to speak when everyone else stayed silent, the place where her life had turned in a completely different direction. A young woman was wiping down a table nearby, small-framed, hair tied up in a hurry, hands moving fast as she worked. Clara saw herself in that image. The young woman looked up, met Clara's gaze, and froze when she realized who was watching her. "Are you Clara Whitmore?" the girl asked, her voice full of disbelief. "I've heard people talk about you." Clara smiled and nodded. "And what's your name?" "Nora. I've only been working here for 3 months." The girl paused, studying Clara with open curiosity. "They say you used to do work like mine. Is that true?" "Yes," Clara said softly. "I used to wipe these tables. I used to clean these rooms. I used to be invisible, the way you are right now." Nora glanced down at the cloth in her hand, then back at Clara. "How did you change?" Clara thought for a moment before she answered. "I didn't change my job. I just dared to speak when I saw something wrong." She looked straight into Nora's eyes. "And you know what? Cleaning work doesn't define you. Nothing defines you except how you choose to live, and what you're willing to stand up for." Nora nodded slowly, as if trying to hold on to every word. Then she went back to work, but her steps seemed lighter, and her back a little straighter. Clara watched the young woman for a moment, then turned to the window. Outside, the city of Boston still glowed, the way it had a year ago, the way it had 10 years ago, the way it would glow for many years to come. But Clara was different. She remembered that night, the night she stood in a conference room full of powerful men with a damp cloth still in her hand, and said the thing no one wanted to hear. She remembered the fear clamping down on her chest, her heart pounding so hard she thought the whole room could hear it. But she also remembered the moment she chose not to stay silent, and how that single moment changed everything. In life, the biggest turning points rarely arrive with noise or applause. They arrive in silence, through small moments, when we choose to speak or to stay quiet. Clara's story reminds us that the truth doesn't belong to the powerful. It doesn't belong to the rich or the high status. The truth belongs to anyone who dares to stand up, trembling, afraid, even mocked, and say, "I see that this is wrong." Kindness isn't always gentle. Courage isn't always loud. Sometimes courage is looking closely when everyone else looks away. Sometimes it's asking one more question when everyone is already tired. Sometimes it's believing your voice matters even when the world tells you it doesn't. And maybe the most important thing this story wants to leave you with is that where you come from doesn't define your worth. Clara was a cleaning girl, and yet she saved an empire, not with money or power, but with honesty and the courage to face the truth. So here's the question for you. Have you ever seen something wrong and chosen to stay silent? What could have changed if you'd spoken up? In our daily lives, how many moments like that have passed by without us taking hold of them? We'd truly love to hear your story. Share your thoughts, your feelings from deep in your heart, in the comments below. Your story might inspire someone else to find their voice. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button and share this video with the people you think need to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next moving stories we bring you every day. Thank you for staying with us to the very end. We hope you found meaning in these moments and carry with you the lessons Clara's journey holds. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, peace, and happiness every single day. Always remember your voice matters, and the truth always needs people brave enough to stand up and protect it. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.